afternoon, sports fans, and welcome to today's lecture on how to host the Olympic Games. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we've got your step-by-step guide to putting on the most famous sporting event in all of human history. Now, when you mention sports in ancient Greece, the first thing that comes to nearly everyone's mind are the ancient Greek Olympic Games. And rightfully so. Not only were these games an integral part of ancient Greek society and culture and politics, they've also left one of the most enduring legacies on the modern world. And to say the Olympics is a big deal today isn't just paying lip service to a popular event. Its economic and cultural impact is quantifiably massive. So for the 2014 Olympic Games in London, the city spent nearly $15 billion with a B dollars to get ready for the games. And in 2018, for the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, nearly 20 million viewers turned in each night to watch the games. And amazingly, those 20 million viewers per night, that was the lowest recorded number of viewers since we started keeping track. So yeah, the Olympic Games in the modern world are a big deal. And guess what? The same goes for antiquity. Now, an event of this size doesn't just magically come together. You need to pick a site, you need to plan things out, and you need to get ready for people to descend on the place from across the known world. So whether you're looking to start a 3,000-year-long tradition, or just looking to host your next party, journey with me as we investigate putting on the games. Now, before we dive into the games themselves, let's go ahead and get ourselves situated geographically. All right? So within the larger context of mainland Greece, Olympia is really in the middle of nowhere. It's located in the northwest Peloponnese, the large peninsula named after Pelops. You remember him, that guy who ended up getting fed to the gods by his dad, but then ended up beating King Oenomaus in that chariot race to win Hippodamia, his new wife, and then went on to found the Olympic Games. Now, even though Olympia was a backwater within Greece, it was kind of central within the larger Greek world. And this is because during the 8th century BCE, the major city-states of the Greek mainland and the islands, they began sending out expeditions to colonize the shores of the larger Mediterranean world. They reached Sicily and they reached Italy. They reached the south coast of France and the Black Sea. They even made it to southern Spain. So when you look at things in the broader Mediterranean picture, it's actually fairly centrally located. Now, one of the things I want you to keep in mind as we go through this lecture is that the political effects of all these independently governed city-states come together and they cause kind of massive issues and problems. It's easy to think of the Olympics today as something that's apolitical, right? Non-political, where countries set aside their politics to come together and compete in sport. But when you think about it, this kind of coming together, it actually provides a great opportunity for city-states to work out issues diplomatically together. So they might not be waging war at the games, but political moves are certainly being made by the aristocratic leaders of various city-states. And the remoteness of the site itself, far away from Athens and far away from Sparta, it made a perfect location for Greeks to come together and strengthen their cultural bonds between their independent city-states. Now, the site of Olympia wasn't so much a full-fledged city-state as it was a religious center. The closest city-state to Olympia was actually that of Elis, just to the northwest of the site. Now, here we're looking at an archaeological plan of ancient Olympia. And the first thing you notice when you look a little closer is that this place isn't dominated by sporting structures. It's dominated by religious structures. We've got the Temple of Zeus here, and we've got the Temple of Hera, and we've got the remains of the Pelopion, and the Metroon, and the altar of Zeus, all right smack dab in the middle of the site. And taken together, this sacred part of the site is known as the altus, and it consisted of a sacred olive grove in addition to all these temples and sanctuaries. Now, what's interesting to scholars in terms of the origin of the Olympic Games is that these religious structures are some of the earliest at the site. The original religious area at Olympia, is known as the altus, a corruption of the Elean Greek word alsos, which means grove, right, based on that olive grove. And this grove was an irregular quadrangular area, measuring about 200 square meters. And inside this sacred grove were the altars and temples of numerous deities. It was originally marked out in the 9th or maybe the 8th century BCE. And some of the earliest religious structures were altars to some of the primeval gods, right, even before the Olympians. So gods and goddesses like Gaia and Rhea. And slightly later, we see evidence for the worship of the Olympian gods and goddesses, right? We've got Hera, whose temple dates to the 6th century BCE. And we've got Zeus here, whose current temple dates to the 5th century BCE. And so Olympia seems to be a place where worshippers of both Zeus and Hera came together to celebrate the gods. And the Olympic Games then later evolved as one of the manifestations of these religious celebrations. Now, to see just how important Zeus was, all we have to do is look at the biggest, the baddest, the best temple at the site of Olympia. The glorious Temple of Zeus. It's located right in the center of the altus, the sacred precinct, and the current version dates to the classical period, the 5th century BCE, the 400s BCE. Now the worship of Zeus here goes back way earlier than that, as archaeologists can tell from the remains of small bronze statuettes. But it was this temple that became renowned throughout the Greek world. And the ancient Greco-Roman traveler Pausanias said that it rose nearly 70 feet high in antiquity. And the roof, instead of being made out of regular tiles, it was made out of a translucent pentelic marble, so that light would shine through into the inner sanctuary. On the eastern pediment, we get the story of the founding myth of Olympia, that chariot race between Pelops and Oenomaus. So hopefully you remember that kind of rather bloody affair from the last lecture. And around the side on the metapiece, we get the sculpture of Heracles completing his 12 labors. Another reference to another one of the origin myths of the Olympic Games. Now, based on the archaeological remains from the site and the written descriptions by visitors to that site, we can get a pretty good idea of what this temple looked like in antiquity. Now, one of the rather jarring things to the modern eye is that this temple would have been really richly painted in antiquity, especially the sculptural area above the columns. So, we tend to think of Greek temples and sculpture as this kind of pristine, pure white marble. But in reality, many of these structures and objects would have been brightly painted. Now, somewhat amazingly and sadly, Greek sculptures were actually scrubbed white in the early modern period to remove any trace of ancient paint, so that they'd better meet the aesthetic expectations of that time. It's kind of sad when you think about it, actually. We lost a lot of information there. Anyway, what you're looking at here is the recreation of the Temple of Zeus, one of the largest temples in Greece, and what it might have looked like during that classical period. But what really stood out was inside. That's what made this temple world famous. So, the cult statue of the god Zeus that stood as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And that's what you're looking at right here. It towered more than 40 feet into the air, and it was chryselephantine in nature. Chrysos was the Greek word for gold, And elephas or elephantos, that was the Greek word for elephant or ivory, right? You put those two things together and you've got an ivory and gold statue of Zeus. It took the famous sculptor, a guy by the name of Phidias, more than a decade to build it in the middle of the 5th century BCE. Now our boy Phidias, he was one of the most famous artists in all of antiquity, right up there with Myron and Praxiteles and all those other boss sculptors. And one of the coolest things is that we still have the archaeological remains of Phidias' workshop. That's right, and he built this thing to the exact same dimensions of the sanctuary of the Temple of Zeus. They were the exact same size. And the reason for this was that he wanted to be able to get a sense for how it would look inside the temple once it was done. Even cooler than that, we actually have the remains of some of the molds that Phidias used in the construction of the statue. Now, they don't look like much now, but think about that. We have the actual tools, right? And the actual cup that was used by the sculptor Phidias, right? Who built one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. This thing is absolutely unreal. A cup with the name of the sculptor Phidias, the molds used by that sculptor in the creation of the cult statue. Okay, so let's summarize where we are. Olympia is somewhat out in the boonies in Greece, right? It's actually fairly central within the larger Greek Mediterranean world, but kind of remote compared to other mainland Greek sites. The center of the site is filled with religious structures, including the world-famous Temple of Zeus with its chryselephantine statue inside. And for this reason, we tend to think that the games evolved out of ritual worship for those gods, rather than the worship of the gods building up around the games which might have come previously. So we're thinking gods first, sports second. Other buildings here, they have ritual or political functions. So the small rectangular buildings just under Mount Cronus, the hill to the north part of the plan here, they were set up by individual city-states to store their votive dedications that they'd make during the games. So you'd have one for Thebes, and you'd have one for Athens, and you'd have one for Sparta, and so forth. Now, towards the bottom here, we've got the Boulaterion, which would have served as the council house for the site. And then finally, when we look out east, we see some of the structures that actually do look like they're finally related to sport. All right, so to make your way to the athletic precinct of the site, you head east out of the religious structures. And when you do that, the first major athletic structure you see is known in Greek as the stadion, from which our word stadium is derived. And to enter the stadion, you go through the arched entranceway that you still see here today. That was known as the crypte. Now, as you go through this, you see the tunnel opens up to a fairly broad expanse, right? And this had grassy banks along the side and then a flat dirt track in the middle. Now, if you had visions of like the Colosseum dancing through your head, right? Marble columns and arches and stone seating, what you'll immediately notice here is that the stadion looks way narrower and way longer, and it suffers from a distinct lack of actual seats or benches. And this isn't because they've all worn away. The only actual permanent seating at the site would have been a set of stone benches centrally located for the officials of the games to use. Regular spectators, like you and me, we would have had to find our seats on those grassy slopes, put out a blanket, pull up a picnic basket, and then go watch the games that way. Now, the stadion itself gets its name from the place where the stadion occurs. And the stadion itself was the sprint race, right? The original ancient Olympic event. And in fact, at the very first Olympics, this wasn't just the first event, it was the only event. Now, according to mythology, the length of the stadion was determined by Heracles marching off 200 steps back to back to back, 1 foot in front of the other, heel to toe. And based on the archaeological remains of most Greek stadia, the stadion race was about 190 to 200 meters in length. So when you do the math there, Heracles must have had feet about 1 meter long. That's like a size 50 sandal there. Anyway, ancient Greek stadia, the plural of stadion, were fairly plain in contrast to most athletic complexes today. or even those in the Roman world. So we can see a few architectural features, however. For one, you can see the small set of box seats reserved for the judges marked off to the right-hand side of the stadion there. And you can also see the starting blocks, the linear line of marble blocks here towards one end of the stadion. And those would have marked the starting point for the races. But the stadion wasn't just the location of the foot races. In addition to that, the stadion hosted all other events, except those involving horses. Those took place in the hippodrome. So even though it feels rather barren today, the stadion would have been one of the most happening locations to observe sport in all the ancient Greek world. Now, the only events that wouldn't have taken place in the stadion were the equestrian events, the horse-based events. Those would have taken place right over here in the hippodrome, right? So the hippodrome literally means the horse track. And this would have been similar in shape to the stadion, very elongated, but much bigger in size because it takes a lot of space to run those chariots around. Now, surprisingly, despite the size of the hippodromes, we have very few archaeological remains of them today, which also makes us think that these would have been fairly basic in nature without a lot of built-up architecture around them. Now, as we saw earlier, the games began as a fairly informal religious activity where several city-states came together to compete. And as time went on, the games got bigger. However, they also fell under the sponsorship of the city-state of Elis. And just like today, these games were held every 4 years. But unlike today, they were held only during the summer, no winter events at all. And that schedule actually makes some practical sense, since summer in ancient Greece was one of the least labor-intensive times of year when it came to agriculture. And that 4-year cycle allowed Elis to save up enough money to put on a really good show. Now, there are 4 sets of officials that actually came together to make the games happen. The Diaetetes were 2 of the highest level supervisory officials in charge of the entire production process. And they worked together with 2 of the Aganothetai, who were in charge of actually running the games and the events. So the Diaetetes and the Aganothetai, they were the organizers of the games. And they were accompanied by several other officials who were in charge of actually executing the events. So the Hellenodikai, they were a series of 9 or 10 judges who sat in that box, that stone box, and judged each event. And then we get the whole thing, right? To get the whole thing started, it was the Spondophori, who went out to announce the games to the different city-states throughout the Greek world. Now, before joining the games, all participants had to agree to the sacred truce, known as the Ekahyria. Now, it's tempting to think that this was an all-encompassing truce that settled all quarrels throughout the Greek world. But in reality, it was more of an agreement that all participants in the games would have safe passage to get there and get home. Wars didn't necessarily end during the games, but those participating in the games would have been exempt from those wars. The games then started with the procession from the city-state of Elis to Olympia. And there, in front of the gods, the athletes and judges swore an oath to participate honorably. And once the games started, the judges had complete control over the functioning of the games and determining the winners and losers. And as you might imagine, this could be fairly precarious. So they'd also have their own set of bodyguards to protect them from upset competitors and their fans. Now, just like the modern world, corruption of the games came in all sorts of ways and shapes and forms. Most of the in-sport rule breaking was punished by flogging. So if you broke a rule, you got flogged. So for example, if you started too early in the stadion race, you got flogged for that. If you eye gouged in the pankration, you got flogged for that. Now, if the rule breaking was bigger than that, or a plot, or something along those lines, some sort of conspiracy, you weren't flogged, but you were fined monetarily. And the money collected from those fines was used to build these statues of Zeus known as the Zanes. And judging by the material wealth of Olympia, this was not an infrequent event. People tried to cheat all the time. And this makes sense if you consider the rule breaking was not just something against your opponent, right? This kind of dedication of the bronze statue. It was also a breach of the oath you swore to Zeus before the games. Hence something that commemorates him to make up for that. All right, so if you remember back to the last lecture, you'll remember that the gold and silver and bronze medals, those are all actually a creation of the new modern Olympic Games, which started back up in 1896. In antiquity, the prize for the victor was a wreath, known in Greek as a Stephanos. Kind of like my last name. Perhaps my ancestors were ancient Olympic victors. Is that likely? Absolutely it is. Anyway, this makes sense when you think about the history of the site, right? One of the founding myths of the games was the one focused on Heracles, who brought the olive tree to the site of Olympia in the aftermath of his 12 labors. Thereafter, a sacred olive grove, right, the aforementioned altus, was set up in the location of the most kind of religious part of the site. Now, the fact that there wasn't some high-value prize was one of the core markers of what we call the Pan-Hellenic, very literally the all-Greek games. And we'll talk more about the Pan-Hellenic games in future lectures. But for now, just know that they're a little unique in the sense that Greeks from all over the world came together to participate here, right? Not just from Athens, not just from Sparta, not just from Thebes. These Pan-Hellenic games hosted Greeks from any Greek city-state all across the Mediterranean. And what you got for winning those wreaths, they were symbolically valuable, not monetarily valuable. And if you remember back to the funeral games of Patroclus, right, at the end of the Iliad, the prizes given out there, they were very valuable monetarily. So things like metal or horses or olive oil. Persian visitors to the games, for example, they found these non-monetary prizes, the wreaths, very, very strange. They wondered, why are people competing so hard for something that's not worth anything? But that's not to say that the winners never got anything. Simply that the official prize of the Olympics, and the Pan-Hellenic Games more generally, wasn't monetarily valuable. When winners got back home to their home city-states, those home city-states often provided very valuable gifts to the winners because of the prestige that they brought to that city-state because of their victory. So things like food or olive oil, or they'd throw parades, or they'd write songs in their honor. So even though the Olympics didn't give you something monetarily valuable, your home city-state might upon your return. But the Olympics themselves, right, they only gave you that simple olive wreath if you won one of your events. Now, we saw earlier in this lecture that the ancient Greeks swore an oath to participate peacefully and honorably in the ancient Olympic Games. But we also saw that the ancient Greeks were no stranger to corruption at the games. So much so that there was a standard punishment if you got caught cheating. You were either flogged or you had to put up one of these bronze statues. Well, the Olympics might look totally different 2,500 years later, but the corruption, it's still as rampant as ever. Let's start with the IOC, the International Olympic Committee itself, founded by Pierre de Coubertin back in 1896. So this is the group that gets to decide whether the Olympics are held where the Olympics are held every 4 years. Or, kind of every 2 years now that we alternate summer and winter. Because the Olympics have reemerged as such a prestigious and potentially lucrative business for the host country, bribery has become rampant among IOC members, with the potential host countries trying to sway the votes of the committees. And the US isn't immune to this. Back in 1998, the United States was bidding for the 2002 Winter Olympics to be held in Salt Lake City. And then 6 of the committee members were expelled for accepting bribes. Everything from cash, to gifts, to medical expenses, to college tuition for their children, to plastic surgery for their spouses. Now, for the 2020 Olympics, or I guess now the 2021 Olympics in Japan, there are already accusations that advertising executive Haruki Takahashi had spent more than $8 million in bribes in an attempt to get the Olympic Games to be hosted at the site of Tokyo. And once the Games have been secured, the corruption gets even worse. So in the 2016 Rio de Janeiro Olympics, these were rife with accusations of bribes and kickbacks for construction firms in charge of building the sporting infrastructure. And the IOC committee members who attended the games or traveled there for their preparation, they were getting $900 a day in per diem for their travel. Someone needs to tell the university here that I need that kind of money when I travel. Anyway, the events themselves were also hotbeds for corruption and cheating. So most recently, Russia has been at the center of this controversy. And in 2016, the Olympics in Rio, more than 100 Russian athletes were banned from competition after testing positive for blood doping. And further investigation suggests that this was sponsored by the Russian government itself, right? This wasn't a one-off. The government itself was sponsoring it. And as a result, the verdict came down recently that Russia is banned from the next 2 Olympics. I don't know about you, but I think they should reinstitute the practice that cheaters should have to build giant bronze statues of Zeus as penance for their crimes. It would make for an awesome link to antiquity and some cool art at the games. Alright, you have made it to the end of another lecture. Today we have taken a look at what it actually takes to put on the ancient Olympic Games. And along the way, we've seen that Olympia isn't just the site for sports, right? It's a religious sanctuary dedicated in large part to the god Zeus. And what a dedication it was! The temple of Zeus glistened under a roof of Pentelic marble, and the chryselephantine statue of Zeus stood as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The nearby city-state of Elis took care to actually put on the games, and they did so with a series of officials and a sacred truce performed by all the athletes. Nonetheless, corruption and cheating occurred in the ancient world just as it does today. But back then, you had to build a bronze statue of Zeus if you got caught. And if you found your way to victory, you were awarded an olive wreath from the tree that was first brought to Olympia by Heracles himself. And upon your return home, you'd be showered with praise and gifts from your home city-state. So next time you're planning an event, don't fly by the seat of your pants. Plan it all out, demand an oath, and maybe build a statue to Zeus. Just a couple lessons you can learn from putting on the Olympic Games.